Welcome to Bunnyman Reads. I will be reading several Halloween tales from early American literature, mostly published in pulp magazines from 1920 to 1930. Sit back and relax as you listen to these stories, tantalizing terror, and let the Halloween spirit take over you. First tale comes from Weird Tales Volume 4, Number 2, published in 1924. Through this romantic tale of love and rapture stalks the grim specter of tragedy. It's The Vow on Halloween by Lyllian Huntley Harris. It was Halloween, the time of revelry, when mysticism holds full sway and hearts are supposed to be united beneath the magic glow of dim lanterns. It was a time of apple bobbing, fortune-telling, and masking in motley raiment. The whole glamour over by the light of wishing candles. Amid such scenes, one never thinks of tragedy, but it treads apace sometimes among the gay revelers, and many a domino or cowl covers that which could make the staunchest heart quake. It is as different from the gay exterior as darkness is from light. The lantern glimmered, the vari-colored lights shading and darkening with the winds that soughed through the beautiful old garden where the fete was held. The pergolas standing white aloft from surrounding density made wonderful trysting places for the age-old stories of love to be whispered. "You made me very happy tonight, Audrey," a deep voice was whispering. "I think that all my afterlife will be pained with gratitude for this moment of bliss, when you would vouchsafe no word of hope, not even one of pity. I felt hopeless, broken. Life seemed as senseless as a stupid rhyme. But now, dearest, life's cup is filled to be overflowing." His lips met hers in a lingering caress. For a moment the lantern seemed to flicker and dim. The slight shudder ran over her slender frame. She freed herself gently. "I cannot expect you to understand, Arthur," Audrey replied. "Why you were kept waiting. The silence encompassed the whole earth and sky to me. It's been a frightful reality, which my tongue refused to explain until today. My mental anguish has well nigh swayed my reasons. A year ago tonight, I experienced a terrible ordeal, more uncanny because it has seemed impossible for me to shake off the pall of it. It has changed the course of my life. For a year I have lived the life of a senseless thing, a piece of clay merely breathing, eating, sleeping, but with no soul left me." The voice trailed off to nothingness, and for a while both were silent. He was awed by her utterness. His arms tightened around her. "Poor Audrey," he whispered. "You must not worry yourself needless. Is not illusion a sort of night to the mind which we people with dreams?" "It was no illusion, Arthur, but grim reality. But last night a dream came to me, which seemed to awaken my dead sensibilities, cut loose the spell under which I was living. In it I was commanded to tell you all." Gently he caressed her. "Tell me what you wish, dear, and nothing more. Remember, hope is better than memory. I am listening." "I shall tell you all you suffered. Say nothing shall be withheld. My troubles began when my father had financial reverses. I gave music lessons to eke out a meager income, but this time Rothschild Manning came into my life. He loved me at sight as intensely as I loathed him. One glance from his slanting, shifty eyes was sufficient to set me cowering to my chair. If his hand by chance touched mine, cold chills chased over my body. He was like some demon, waiting his chances to spring up on his prey. Imagine my dismay when my parents immediately began insisting my marriage with this monster. His fortune would retrieve ours, and would regain the position we had lost by financial reverses. The horror of it! After one lengthy argument, I felt my brain reel. I fell upon my knees, crying and imploring my father to spare me this ordeal. He was obdurate and insistent upon my consent. Finally he sent for Manny, and placed my hand in his, and gave me to him formally. But not once did I encourage him, and he seemed to change into a veritable demon. His eyes would become crafty as he looked at me, and his face assumed an expression of sardonic intensity. One day, the day that is seared upon my memory, 1 year ago tonight, he sought me out. I was alone in the house, my father having gone to the lodge. Manny was trembling under some terrible emotion. "Your welcomes don't shine forth from your eyes, my dear," he said, as he seated himself and took my hand. With a gesture of horror I shaked it away. The emotion seemed to infuriate him and deepen the intensity of his eyes. "I came to take you driving," he said, with a quick intake of his breath. "The night is lovely, and my car is without. It will be yours when you are mine." There was a steely intensity in his gaze, directed upon me. "I don't care to go," I said quietly. "Pray reconsider. I may be able to persuade you to feel differently if you give me a chance." "Here," I interrupted. "I will do nothing of the sort," I cried. "I will go nowhere with you. I want nothing to do with you, and God willing, I will never be your wife." My words infuriated him. He was under some powerful influence of evil. He seized my wrist and jerked me out of my chair, shook me violently. My senses reeled, and I must have lost consciousness. All I remember was being held up by a main force, those horrible, evil eyes boring malevolently into mine, while he shouted in my ear, "Remember, young lady, you will drive with me yet. Maybe not now, but someday. This is not a threat. It is a declaration, and neither stars, moon, nor heaven itself shall deliver you from it." I was thrown violently from the floor. Merciful oblivion came to me. For days I was ill, not knowing, not caring what happened, craving death to relieve me from the sinister influence and deliver me from the effect of that horrible vow on Halloween. When I recovered, I learned that Manny, driving his car that day, madly had lost control and had come to a horrible end. His evil influence seemed to hold me drugged into his power. I longed to die, but death does not come when one craves it. I lived, a piece of senseless clay, until you came along. And when I looked into your eyes, I felt that heaven had been kind in denying me my desire. My heart, my soul went out to you, but I couldn't let you know. I could never become your wife with the horrible vow sounding in my ears, the terrible power controlling me. Then yesterday, in the dim watches of the night, a dream came to me. A voice spoke and said, "Love beyond prices is yours. Take and cherish it, lest the priceless gift be withdrawn." I woke, happy myself once more, grateful that life can come to me again. She nestled close, and his hand caressed her hair. "My darling, how you have suffered. My whole life shall be spent in keeping you free of the mirage of this terrible experience." "Beg pardon," a suave voice interrupted, and a cowled figure drew near. "This is my dance, I believe. It's not too warm to repair to the ballroom. I have my car here. A spin will refresh us both." The cowled figure bowed low, and Andre glanced at her card and arose with a little laughter. "You'll excuse me, Arthur, won't you? It seems that this august domino person has prior claim." With the light hand of the newcomer's arm, she was lost in the crowd. The music from the palm-shaded orchestra stirred forth, hummed, throbbed, and sobbed into a soft requiem. 2 days later, some belated wayfarers came upon a young woman who seemed unable to move from her seat in an automobile. Upright beside her was a skeleton whose sightless eye sockets even then bored into the soul from which the light of reason had fled forevermore. Manny had kept his threat. In an old moonlight garden, under the white pergola where he had lived his one moment of bliss, a figure fell, turned into sudden clay, as a smoking weapon could testify. The end of Tale 1. Story number 2, The Phantom Torturer. Ghost Stories, Volume 3, Number 4, 1927. I caught her armed, and the strange old-fashioned night-gown she wore, and dragged her back. The Phantom Torturer. By Harvey S. Cottrell. How long the bottle had been in the pool I do not dare say, when at least I succeeded in snaring it with my water-soaked handkerchief. It provided to be squat, round, brown affair with a long neck, such a bottle as is seen nowadays only in antique shops at a good price. Seaweed festooned clung to a stopper which had been driven and sealed with red wax. Carefully, I made my way back up the rocks, and with all the pride of a pup retrieving a ball, I handed it to Shella. Her great brown eyes danced with anticipation. She held the bottle to the sky, stripping the seaweed from it with her shapely hands. "Look," she cried. I told her there is a paper in it, some message from the deep. Her delights knew no bounds. She handed it to me quickly, waiting with childlike curiosity, while with my knife I picked away the wax and tried to pry out the stopper. But the stopper was too tight, and besides, the neck of the bottle was so long, I doubted I could reach the paper. "I'll have to smash it," I cried at last. Shella's face clouded. "It's a shame," she said. "I'd like to keep it as a souvenir of our hike. It's so old and funny, but if you're sure you cannot get the paper out in any other way." "Shall not be any souvenir of this hike. The memory of it would be lasting enough." I broke the bottle on a rock. It was tough glass, and I needed a hard blow. We were like children with our heads together, in our eagerness to see the message contained. It was a yellow scrap of paper, eventually torn from an ancient account book. Upon one side was written in a feminine hand that would have been dainty and fine if the proper writing materials had been used. But this message had been written under difficulties. Some clumsy instruments, perhaps a sliver of wood. The characters were barely decipherable, and though I did not tell Shella, I had a suspicion that the fluid in which they were written was human blood. "Hold it to the sun this way," Shella commanded. I glanced up at the bearings. The late afternoon sun was passing behind a dark cloud now. The breeze was coming in gusts. I frowned, for the sky was threatening one of those quick summer storms that swept up suddenly on the main coast with a tearing, retching wind and a brief, heavy downpour of rain. But we were too intent on our find to worry about weather. Heads together still, Shella's shoulder against mine, word by word, we made out the message. "Save me. I am in the slave house, a captive there, imprisoned in the walls. The master threatens me with death. Help me. Annette Balou." The slave house. Why, that was the old mansion close to the high cliff. Further along the shore, we could see its roof just over the rocks. It had a history, that house did. It was built before the Civil War, and its owners, John Richards, an eccentric old merchant, had been an abolitionist. In the days of the Underground Railroads, from which slaves from the southern plantations were helped to escape, this old house was used as a way station for the fugitives. According to popular belief, they were underground passages leading to the cove where ships from the south had once anchored. In a great room in the third story where the slaves waited until they could be smuggled across the border to Canada. Shella knew the story as I. It was a popular legend at the Bleecker house. "What do you suppose the message means?" she asked, sitting herself on a rock, gazing thoughtfully out to sea. "I can only guess," I replied. "Of course, Richards had a bad name in this community. He was supposed to charge the slaves a stiff price for his help, and there were many whispered tales about him and his feminine guests. He died, you remember, under mysterious circumstances in that old house. They said he was frightened to death by the ghost of a woman who had been killed there." "How terrible!" Shella exclaimed. "Oh, that's bunk, I suppose," I said. "Probably he had heart trouble and kicked out natural enough." Shella mused. "I wonder." Nobody seemed to know who owned the place now. Of course, there were visitors to it who told of meeting an ancient man, a giant of a man, who showed them through some of the rooms, but was taciturn and uncommunicative. Moreover, he was careful where he took them, and then he denied there were passages behind the walls. Shella was still meditative. "Just think," she said. "This bottle has been floating here in this pool for years. going round and round and never getting anywhere. It's like some lives, isn't it? I wonder what became of Annette Ballou, who was and why she was in prison. Do you suppose she ever escaped? Undoubtful, I said. I couldn't believe a woman was allowed to die in the old house behind the walls like that. It would be too horrible. I wish we could go up there and look through the house. You got a chance, I said hurriedly. The sky was darkening fast. High up were mares' tails, circus clouds switched into fantastic shapes by the wind. Lower down was a satchel of small, puffy, black clouds scuttering along in another direction. But chose to the earth breeze had suddenly died away. A mist had started over the ocean, and there was an ominous hush that seemed to portend some cataclysmic happening. I took one look down the bleak, desolate beach and thought too late of the storm. The short 2 hours before dark, and the 4 miles between us and the Bleecker house. Run, Shella, I cried. We've just got time to make the old house before the rain comes. Hurry! Hand in hand we sped along the rocks, jumping, leaping, in danger of slipping. We were breathless as we gained the summit of the higher ground and paused a moment to look back at the racing storm. Then we hurried on. Suddenly the wind caught us in a great rush, almost sweeping us from our feet. Shella clung to me for support. Isn't it terrible? She screamed in my ears. Hold fast, I cried. We'll make it. Instantly behind the fury of the wind came the rain and a great cloudburst, wetting us through and through. Unfortunately, the rain was warmer than the chill breath of the wind. I was glad for Shella's sake, for her wet clothes were wrapped about her graceful form in a disheartening and hampering way. Clinging to each other for support, we fought our way to the old house. It loomed above us in the half-darkness that came with the storm, foreboding and grim. As we neared it, I could see the rooms, high-studded in accordance with an old-time custom of house-building, and its second story was high above us, while its third was hidden among the tops of the great elms that surrounded it. It was built of wood, square and unyielding. Long ago it had been painted a dark color, but in the years this had worn away, and the broad clapboards had become weathered and gray as an ancient skull. A square, glass-enclosed cupola was on top, like a sailor's lookout station. I imagine that many a time crazy old Richard had watched there with his spyglass for vessels that would bring slaves to his home and wealth to his pocketbook. The wind almost blew us up a broad step and onto the deep porch with its great colonial columns. On any other occasion, it would have been a delight to visit the place and explore it as far as we would be permitted. But with the wind howling at us and the rain coming in torrents, we had only a mind to gain its shelter and get back our breath. Hardly had we stepped on the porch before the massive door swung open before us. It was dark within, and I could not see by what device the door worked. Then I perceived there was a human figure in the darkness, and a voice deep and unearthly was bidding us enter. We did not hesitate, not with the storm outside. We almost ran through the portal, and quickly the door closed behind us. Just a moment, Master. I'll get a light, came the weird voice. It startled us. Quickly there was the scratching of a match, followed by the sputtering of a candle set in a bracket at the end of the hall. As the candle's light became steady and my eyes grew accustomed to its glow, I was seized with a shock that nearly unnerved me. Before us stood a man. But what a man! He would have been nearly 7 foot tall if he had drawn his stooped frame to its full height. His shoulders were nearly a yard across and his arms were long. Like an ape's, his face was wrinkled and mummy-like. He was old, terribly old, yet he seemed lithe and active, a wonderful specimen of strength. With all his extreme politeness, there was something sinister about him. I could not explain. I shivered. Shella had a simple reaction. She gasped when she saw him, and I could see a look of fear on her face. The man saw it too. "Do not fear, lady," he said humbly enough, though I thought I caught a leer in his glance. Dolman is your servant. He will care for you. Perhaps the lady would like to enter to a chamber and dry her clothes." He did not wait for her to acquiesce. With grave dignity he led us up the broad staircase to the second floor. The massiveness of the interior was akin to Dolman himself. There was nothing particularly ornate about the place. The great timbers that might have served for the ribs of a whaling vessel were exposed in the ceiling, and the floorboards, carpeted with wonderful old rag rugs, were 14 to 18 inches across, the heart lumber of virgin forest. Though the wind outside blew a perfect hurricane, there was neither give nor creak to the house. It was built to stand for ages. Dolman led us to the chamber, as massive as the rest of the house. In it was a great four-posted mahogany bed that would delight the heart of an antique dealer, and keeping with this was other furniture quite as old and beautiful. The neatly made-up bed, like the room itself, was clean to the point of immaculateness. More rag rugs were on the floor, and at one side was a great open fireplace. It was in front of this that Dolman crouched, and in a few moments a cheerful blaze was crackling up its ponderous throat. Rising, Dolman waited. It was apparent he expected me to retire with him. I hesitated. That look of fear still lingered in Shella's face. Suddenly she turned to me and whispered, "Don't leave me," she pleaded. "Oh, sweetness, don't leave me here. There's something terrible about this house." "But Shella, you ought to dry your clothes," I said. "They're wet and you'll catch cold. Take them off and dry them before the fire, and I'll come back when you're ready." "Oh no," she whispered. "I'm afraid. Afraid of him. Afraid of the shadows. It's gruesome." Dolman had been fumbling in a chest as he walked, but now he stood watching us. He seemed to understand what we whispered. "The master can wait nearby," he said consolingly, "just in the next room." Again Sheila started to protest, but at an instant Dolman stepped forward, extending to her the article he had taken from the chest. "Dolman's sorry, lady, that there is nothing better," he explained. I did not know much about women's things then. That was before I married Shella, but her fear suddenly left her and she gave a gasp of delight. The article was a feminine night-robe, a lovely thing of soft linen. It had an old-fashioned high neck, and Shella told me afterwards it was so exquisitely sewn by hand that her woman's heart marveled at it, and for a moment she was quite lost in admiration. As she examined it, the giant man smiled patronizingly and motioned for me to leave. He waited humbly for me to pass out ahead of him. I did, and he shut the door behind us, opening another door close by. He waited again for me. I passed in, and as he was about to close the door after me, he remarked, "Dolman will call the master when the lady is ready." There was something ominous about the shutting of the door. It seemed so final. I looked at its stout breadth, and an uncomfortable feeling assailed me. I felt as though I were in a prison. The room was a twin in which I had left Shella, with its great four-poster bed, its candles burning in a bracket, its heavy furniture, its fireplace. The very whiteness of the place oppressed me. Though my clothes were as white as Shella's, the man had not waited to put coals in the fireplace. There was something strange about that too. Vaguely I noticed that the fireplace was not blackened with soot. I studied it. It was too clean. The silence was depressing. It was as still as though I had been miles from anywhere. Even the wind blowing a gale outside could be heard only faintly. Sitting there on the bed, about decided to quit this room and stand guard at Sheila's door, when there came a soft scraping sound as though someone were brushing along the wall behind me. With it came the sound of footsteps, measured and slow, footsteps of an elderly man. I sprung up and turned to the wall. The sound ceased. "What the devil," I exclaimed, "this place with its trick stairways and giants and whatnot is getting on my nerves." I stared for the door, determined to be out of it. Instantly, I stopped still in my tracks. Someone was staring at me. I could not see anyone, but I had the feeling of being watched. It was a creepy sensation, and shivers coursed down my spine. I turned and faced the wall. It was a great panel of dark wood, unbroken from even a scratch. Who was there? What was it that looked out of the wall? The footsteps sounded again. They were descending a stairway behind the wall. Slipping around the bed, I applied an ear to the panel. I could hear nothing. I slapped it with my hand. It lacked the hollow sound I expected. It was as solid as stone. Again came the feeling that I was being watched by an invisible eye. I swung around and stared about me. The room was unchanged. "Damn this place," I cried. "I'll get Sheila, and storm or no storm, we'll get out." I thought I heard a chuckle of amusement somewhere. I listened. For some moments I had been aware of a musty odor that I had attributed to the room's lack of airing. It plagued me, a sick, sweet smell that made my nostrils cringe. The odor persisted stronger now. It made me drowsy. Standing by the bed, listening again for the chuckle, there swept over me a great desire to lay there for a moment, only for a moment, and then I would return to Sheila. I squared my shoulders, trying to throw off the desire. I was so drowsy. Just to lay there a moment would be the greatest comfort I can imagine in this life. Suddenly the room seemed closing in upon me. My head dropped, my body swayed. Before I could prevent myself, I pitched over upon the bed, sinking miles deep into the most glorious, festival slumber I had experienced in many a day. I did not dream. I was conscientious only for a great fatigue, a blissful comfort on the broad bed. My eyes were as heavy as lead, my body relaxed. I could not have fought off that feeling for the world. I did not want to. How long I stayed there I cannot imagine. It seemed only a moment. Suddenly I gave a start. So profound was my sleep that I did not immediately know or care where I was. I was drunk on it, immersed in it. But as I lay there, my subconscious mind persisted. I must give up. I cannot stay. I must. In an instant, without any reasoning, I was bolted upright, listening. Someone had called me. The room was as still as death. But somewhere, somebody had spoken my name. It was as though the last whispers of it still rang in my ears. I thought I heard the door close softly. I struggled to my feet, tottering. Stupid. Through my dull senses I became aware of that soft scraping sound somewhere in the wall. There were footsteps again, but this time they were light and quick, the footsteps of a woman. And then I became deathly sick. My head was aching as though 1,000 devils beat upon it with hammers. Nausea swept over me, and I put out my hand to a bedpost to steady myself. The room whirled about me, and then I knew. This was not the odor of must. It was ether. Some sort of gas was in the room, and the windows were closed. I staggered to open them. I tried one after another. They were as securely bolted as the wall in which they were set in. The candle was a blue flame. I staggered back in amazement as I saw it was half gone. It had been new when I came into the room. Was it possible I had been asleep for an hour or two? But the cry, the recollection of it was clear in my mind now. Harv! I had been. Oh, Harv! It was the loving diminutive in which Sheila, and she alone addressed me, but it had not been Sheila's voice. Then who? What were they doing with Sheila? I staggered to the door, my hands stretching out to the knob to throw it open. Tottering, I gave the knob a wrench. My effort and shakiness of my legs threw me against it. I looked to the door, uncomprehending. Again I reached for the knob, turned it carefully and pulled. The door would not open. I tried to shake it. It was as firmly fastened as the windows. Once again I tried. It would not open. And then it dawned upon my stupid brain. It was locked on the outside. Moreover, I glanced downward. I saw a stain upon the floor, a stain of some liquid that had been poured under the door. No need to tell me what it was. I knew it for the ether that had caused me to sleep and now made me ill. I was insane with fear and alarm. I did not think of myself. My thoughts were only of Sheila and her safety. I pounded on the door. Again and again I strained at the knob. "Sheila," I cried, "Doman." There was no response. How my head ached, my tongue was thick, my throat dry. Air! I wanted air from my constricted lungs, my aching head. I staggered to the window and tried again to open them. At last, in desperation, I drove my elbow through the panel. In a rush there came the life-giving air, fresh with the tang of the sea and the cleanliness of the rain. I drew it in great lungfuls. It was tonic to me. My head cleared, my brain became more active. But Sheila, I must get to her. With a pillow from the bed, I beat out all the glass and leaned from the window to look at the ground below. It was a good 25 feet to the uneven surface there. If I jumped, I was certainly to break a leg. The rain had ceased. The storm had passed almost as quickly as it came. To my amazement, the sky was lightened by the gorgeous rising sun, although patches of clouds still scudded before the breeze. It was early evening. I knew the time when the guests of the hotel were gathering to dance under the soft glow of lights. Lyllian, the hotel seemed far, far away now. I tried to find some way to getting down. I searched the wall. It was bare as a precipice, the nearest tree limb 10 feet away. And then, as I looked down into the garden, the blood froze in my veins. Sheila was down there. Sheila, the girl I loved. She stood below my window. She was all filmy white in the moonlight, clad in the old-fashioned robe that reached to her ankles, her long hair flowing on her shoulders. Slowly, as if walking in her sleep, she took step after step, feeling her way, yet not conscious. She was being drawn towards the sea by some power greater than her own. "Sheila," I cried, fear gripping me until I was cold. "Sheila!" She did not heed me, but kept on and on, slowly, like an automaton, and always towards the sea. And as indistinctly my eyes followed the direction she took, I saw two objects. It made me ache with terror. A short distance ahead of her was that monstrous man. The man was walking towards her as though he had led Sheila with strange hypnotic power. And beyond them both, out there on the bosom of the cove, and in the path of the rising sun, was a small boat with a single sail. At its stern was a figure of an old man, tall, stately, commanding, his gaze directed at Sheila. He was waiting patiently for her to come to him. I thought at first the figure was burnished by the moon's beams. As I gazed again, I turned sick with this sight. The figure was glowing, illuminated by a radiance of its own. The radiance was a horrid, sickly, greenish cast against the silver of the moon. And as I looked, I suddenly perceived that the figure was intangible, as transparent as a thin cloud of mist. I screamed aloud. Cold sweat stood on my forehead. In God's name, what was it all? Was that the spirit of John Richards? What wicked old monster, exploiter of women, seeking to drag Sheila in death to some foul existence he had prepared for her soul? 200 yards in front of her was the cliff. If she kept on, led by the man, she would have plunged to her death. How could I get her? I must. She could not hear me under the devil's spell. I must save her. Again I thought of springing from the window, but if I were injured, I could be of no use to her. I must save myself to save her. Desperately I turned from the window back to the door. The door held fast. Like a madman I ran about the room, shouting, pounding on the walls. There was no way but the window. As I stumbled towards it, I tripped on one of those rag rugs. In an instant I had fallen against the fireplace. My fist crashed upon its side, my head barely escaping its brickwork. But something occurred that made me heedless of any hurt. A dull, hollow sound had followed the impact of my fist. Quickly I sprang to my feet, pounded on the wall at the end of the fireplace. Again came the hollow sound. The wall was not solid. There was an opening behind it, the secret stairs. I did not wait to hunt for any concealed spring. I swung a chair above my head to send it crashing through a panel. Again I swung, and a panel splintered further beneath my blow. Within was darkness, but I caught the candle from the wall and shielding it with one hand, I crawled through the opening. Surely there must be some way out of the house at the end of this passage. The space in the wall was small. Moreover, the passage turned quickly to right angles, and I knew now why Bunnyman had built no fire. The fireplace was false. Hesitating, feeling my way, I squeezed myself around the corner and peered ahead of me. A cry sprang to my lips. I fell back so quickly I stuck my head against a beam, dropping the candle. For a moment I clung in terror to the wall beside me, for as I turned the corner I stumbled upon the bones of a human body. If the candle had gone out, I would have struggled out of that hole back into the room, but it sputtered at my feet and gave a faint light. For a moment I was sick with horror. Gradually my courage turned, however, and the thought of getting to Sheila became uppermost again. Painfully I reached for the candle and picked it up. I held it carefully while I gazed at the skeleton. I knew enough about anatomy to see that it had been a woman. Broad pelvic bone told me that. Shreds of fabric still clung to it as though the clothes that had once covered its body had long since wasted away. I hated to push it aside. I did not like to desecrate the bones of the dead, but Sheila. And then my blood ran cold. Before my eyes a misty figure was forming. It was vague as the figure out there in the little vessel. It was the vision of a young woman dressed in the costume of 3 generations ago. I felt her strange eyes fixed upon me, and I heard the soft whispers in her voice. "You did not come in time," she said. "My message was so long in reaching you. It is I, Annette Ballou, who sent it, prisoned here after the master had his way with me. It was here I die." "And here," I cried hoarsely. "Bunnyman did it. The master's servant," she said sadly. "He got them all for the master, the women, for 3/4 of a century. Now he has got them. But come, there's no time to lose." I followed because I could not help myself. I was like a sleepwalker. She led me down a flight of narrow steps. I hardly could squeeze my way along. Dust rose about me in a cloud, blurring my sights. Again we turned a sharp corner, almost too narrow for me. Down another flight and into the cellar we went. Across a dirt floor she seemed to float rather than walk. Into another passageway she led me, and I knew we were passing under the foundation of the house. We came then to a tiny vault. The ghost woman stood aside from me. She pointed to a small door halfway up the wall. With a gasp I ran forward. I shot back the bolt and threw the door open. A litter of dry leaves and dirt rattled to my feet, and above I can see the stars. I dropped my candle and seized the sides of the doorway. Quickly, I drew my body through the opening. Now I was in a circle of shrubbery in the garden, but for one bewildered moment I did not know which way to turn. Then I crashed through the shrubbery and saw Sheila. She was within a few feet of the cliff, her form white in the moonlight, her steps quickening. In another moment she could go crashing down the rocks. Out there on the water that strange figure waited, straight and commanding as a general, and from his spectral mouth issued a low groaning sound that came over the waters as enticing as the plaint of a mother for its child. But the horror of it, the note of the evil desire that was in the voice. "Sheila! Sheila!" I cried. "Sheila!" She was at the very brink of the rocks, but the sound of my voice she hesitated. Plunging, slipping, I raced across the uneven ground. "Sheila!" I cried. "Wait for me. It's Harv." She would have gone on to her death if some frantic note from my voice had not penetrated her reason. As it was, she hesitated. I was almost up to her now, panting, straining every muscle. I threw myself toward her. She tottered. One step more and she would fall. My hand shot out. The moss-covered rocks were treacherous, and I fell to my knees. But I caught her arm in the strange, old-fashioned nightgown she wore, and dragged her back from the edge of the cliff. Before I could struggle to my feet, I was entangled in heavy rope, my arms clamping to my sides, my legs tied. The crafty Doman had taken me by surprise. My chance of resistance was past. He dragged me towards the house. I caught the last glimpse of Sheila laying stunned on the rocks. I would not give up. I withered and twisted with desperate strength. I kicked and struggled. Doman only laughed. Up the steps, into the hall, and up the broad stairs he dragged me. He did not stop the room where I had been imprisoned before. She carried me on toward the top of the house. Was he then going to throw me out of the window? Or would he only lock me in as he had done on the other floor? If he had wanted to kill me, he would have thrown me from the rocks. What was his purpose? He stopped at last and unlocked the door, crossed a darkened room to a window lighted by the full rays of the moon. The window sashes themselves had been removed, so the frames were open. Near the window was a wide, table-like board, tipped back to an angle of 20 degrees, and supported by old packing cases. My heart failed me. I knew what he intended. I was to be exposed to the elements. I had read of that. They were in the other days harsh masters thought ill fortune for them to take the life of a refractory slave, much as they desire to do so, to relieve themselves of any conscientiousness of murder, yet to produce the same result. They left slaves strapped to such boards, to the will of the elements. It was a cruel process. The victim was pinned on his back, spread eagle-fashioned, where sun and rain, wind and cold, thirst and hunger would cause him to suffer until such a time as he begged for mercy or was released by death. It was whispered that such a thing had been practiced in this evil house, and now I was to suffer it. It was like being hung on a cross, with my arms and legs held in place by chains. It was bad enough to be in that strained position long, but the mental torture was worse than the physical. When I thought of Sheila, on the board, tipped as it was, I could see by craning my neck the phantom boat in the cove, but the ghostly figure no longer was there. What had become of him, I wondered in agony. What had become of Sheila? She was not where I left her, a white figure motionless on the rocks. What had happened? Had she at last gone over the cliff to her death, her soul to be swept up and carried away by that lustful phantom? My thoughts were enough to drive me mad. I had cursed the giant man who had pinned me there.
"You think you get away now?"
he said with a leer.
"No, you stayed till Dolman came for you. The women we take to the master. After a while, I make you a spirit. Maybe you see how the master so loves his women."
"God," I swore, "I'll kill you first, you fiend."
"Oh, no."
There was no vanity in his tone.
"You will not kill Dolman. Dolman cannot be killed. He has lived 100 years. He will live as many more. The witch doctor made him that way."
He saw incredulity in my face, and I thought he would strike me. But suddenly he became grave and communicative.
"You do not believe me,"
he cried, like a petulant child.
"There is only one way to kill Dolman, and that you cannot do. I die only by hand of a woman's ghost. She I killed. Someday she will come for me."
A shudder ran through his great frame. Madman, savage, ghost, or what not, at that moment he was terribly afraid of an unseen spirit that hovered somewhere in the shadows. A sudden thought sprang to my mind. Racked with pain though I was, the words crowded my lips. "Annette Balou!" He almost shrieked in fright at the mention of the name. He dropped to his knees, his eyes rolling, strange sounds falling from his thin lips like the sounds of a hunted animal. But quickly his fear changed. He was humble, obsequious. He bent low, his hands outstretched plaintively. Then a cold, dank gust of air came to me, and footsteps sounded, the footsteps slow and measured, I had heard behind the wall. A commanding voice, deep, resonant, broke the silence.
"Dolman, you devil, you linger. Where is the wench? Bring her to me. I may have her soul before I pluck out your eyes."
I cried out in horror. The odor of the long dead was in my nostrils. I could think only of dry bones and yellow skin as brittle as parchment. A hideous, brittle creature crawling out in a tomb. As I turned my head, I saw him there, this ghost of Richard's. If ever there was passion and evil in a face, it was written there. It was the only face I could see, a face hollow and eyeless, with shrunken hawk-like nose and horrible, discolored teeth between grinning, shrunken lips. The rest of him was a dim outline.
"Yes, master,"
Dolman breathed. In an instant he had turned and dashed out of the room, his great bulk fading in the darkness. I struggled frantically to free myself. Suddenly the stench was no longer with me. One moment the ghost was there, the next he had disappeared. "Oh God!" I cried in my helplessness. "Oh God, give me strength!" A new presence hovered above me. Something light and cool as silk touched me. Suddenly my hand was free. A faint rustling sound. My other hand was free. Weary and aching, I dragged myself to a sitting posture. I was shaking with terror, but I was determined to fight for Sheila to the last ounce of strength. I fumbled at the fetters of my legs, and as I did so I became aware of how I had been freed. In the shadow just out of moonlight was the ghost of Annette Balou. Before I could cry out, she was directing me in the soft, sibilant voice like a whisper in the trees. "Come," she said, "there is yet time, and you are brave. You would have saved me if you had lived long ago. I have led her to the house. I will help you save her now. Come." Painfully I swung off the horrible board, following her through the darkness as one might follow a vague shadow. I came upon an open panel under a window. The whisper of her voice urged me again to follow, and so, bending, half crawling, I entered into another narrow stairway leading downward. Gropingly I followed. Down a corridor no wider than the coffin itself, I was led by the ghost of a woman. Passed down another stairway and another corridor, and now the ghost woman stood aside and pointed. Before me was a narrow door with an ancient latch. I understood. I raised the latch and threw open the door. I sprang into the room, into Sheila's room, and just in time. The giant man had her in his arms. About to pass out of the door, she was fully clothed in her dry garments, but she lay insensible, white, her eyes closed in a swoon. "Drop her, damn you!" I cried. He laughed at me, obsessed with a faith that he could not die. He did not fear me. Stepping to the bed, he placed Sheila there and came crouching for me. His great paws opened and closed as though already they were at my throat. A horrible smile played over his face. Nearer and nearer he came. As quick as the strike of a snake, he caught me by one wrist, twisting me helplessly against him. Then with one hand he held me fast, while with the other he began slowly to press upon my forehead. Lights danced before my eyes, bells were ringing in my ears. Back, back went my head. The blood pounded in my temples. I felt my spine would snap and my throat be torn open from the strain. And then, with his face close to mine, his eyes suddenly became pictures, as though I looked into a stereopticon. And the scene was 1,000,000 years ago, before history, when the earth was hot and steaming, and the waters of the sea were warm. It was upon the seashore that I looked, where a woman, lovely and graceful, her form wrapped in her flowing hair, stood looking into the water. But behind her, from the edge of the forest, came creeping a great black figure, half human, half animal. He was about to spring upon her when she turned and saw him. He cringed away. The animal was Dolman. The woman was Annette Balou. Just as death was upon me, in Dolman's grasp, suddenly the creature shrieked, that high-pitched, wailing note of fear. The pressure on my head was released. I was dropped to the floor as a boy might drop a toy. Dimly I saw the giant man cringing in a corner of the room, his face ashen gray, his great eyes bulging, his monstrous body shook and trembled like a leaf. And in an instant he had leapt to the door and was out of it. And then something white and dim floated past me, faster than the wind, out of the door after him, the ghost of Annette Balou. She it was, he had told me, who only could cause his death. I heard him go crashing down the stairs. I heard him tear at the outer door, and his running, sliding, stumbling footsteps on the uneven ground. I heard his wild cry a moment later, and I fancy I can see his body going crashing over the cliff into the horrible whirlpool where lately he would have led. Harvey wished Sheila. I did not wait to investigate. I half dragged, half carried her out of the house and into the cold night air and under the light of the moon. I did not stop until she awoke and protested and told me she had a horrible dream in which a lovely woman at last had come to her. Distilling nervous tense, we clung to each other and watched. For out over the sea, far away, barely discernible, and the moon's path was a phantom boat, with a grey ghost in the stern, another figure, none the more tangible because of his blackness, but like its master, as transparent as glass, and the boat and the figure and it grew smaller and smaller as it travelled into the path of the moon. He never found the man's body in the horrible whirlpool, nor did we ever hear or see the ghost of Annette Ballou again, or ever learn her story. But as we stood there watching, suddenly a tongue of flame leapt from the old house. It may have been caused by the candle I dropped, by some defect in the fireplace in Sheila's room. I did not know. In any event, the house was soon a great bonfire that attracted even the guests from our hotel 4 miles away. It did not take long for the house to be raised. The flames did their work neatly. No more slaves' flesh or ghosts in the spirit would tramp its encased stairways. Unnumbered tragedies had taken place within its walls. It was just as well the house should be destroyed. Friends who came to see the fire took us back to the hotel in their car. We did not tell them the story of the night, nor we know they would not believe us. Sheila, long afterward, took from among her keepsakes the letter we had found in the strange old bottle. When she had read it, she looked dreamily into the distance, and I think there were tears in her eyes. But she did not speak, nor did she answer me when I spoke to her. She did not tell me, but I think she was voicing the prayer of the repose of the soul of Annette Ballou.
And for our last story, I'll be reading Last Act October by Tigrina. It was published in the Magazine of Horror, number 4, 1964. A little bit of a backstory into this. Tigrina is a name which many science fiction enthusiasts who encountered the strange and sometimes wonderful world of amateur fan publishing used to see in various publications emanating from the Los Angeles area. Beyond this, we can tell you nothing except that we may have known at one time Tigrina has escaped. No matter. The point is really the story below, which we trust will keep you in suspense until the end. The motley crowd of villagers flocked about the town square like vultures. Although they had been accused of anticipating with sadistic pleasure the spectacle of a young girl being burned to death, they would have denied it vehemently. Despite a vaguely sensed repressed excitement, they would have insisted that duty required that they be present at a meeting out of justice. A chill October wind rustled the autumn leaves along the rooted main thoroughfare and caused the idle specters to shrug themselves deeper into their homespun woolen. The center of attraction, a comely lass in her teens, clad only in a crude white shirt, shuddered too as she strained against the bond which held her squarely to the stake. Squire Picton, the self-styled witch-finder, sat astride his fat bay mare, an expression of smug self-righteousness stamped upon his features. He had been responsible for bringing this sinful creature to justice. Conscientious of the imposing figure that he made, and of the awe in which the townspeople held him, he called out, "Yea, and well met ye shiver, May Clayton, though methinks ye'll never shiver for long when the raving flames cleanse the sin from your soul." His remark, addressed for benefit of the onlookers as well, brought ferocious, half-hysterical accents from the mob. "Let's get on with the burning," came a voice from the outskirts of the crowd, and the frenzied cry was echoed from hundreds of throats. "Yea, burn her, burn the witch." Although public executions of witches had occurred at large towns quite a distance away, this was the first one for the little village of Bloomsbury, and it made the townspeople feel important. The fact that the accused was a beautiful young girl had attracted residents from adjacent towns for miles around to augment the already enormous crowd. Righteous housewives glared indignantly at the alleged witch and commented upon the bold indecency of the creature in appearing in such a scant attire. It did not occur to them that the poor girl did not appear thus voluntarily, and that no other garments had been furnished. Wide-eyed children stared in wonder, clutched at their mother's voluptuous skirts, and peeped out shyly. The menfolk evidence of a grim sort of satisfaction that justice has to be done, although a few secretly felt pity for the defenseless girl, but salved their consciences by persuading themselves to believe that it was the girl's enchanting witch-like loveliness which aroused in them this unworthy emotion. Goggled-eyed youths further back in the crowd craned their necks and jostled one another for a glimpse of this wicked beauty who had been tied and sentenced to die for the practicing of witchcraft. Squire Picton himself dismounted from his horse and strode boldly across the square to ignite the fire. A breathless hush fell upon the crowd. The soughing wind was the only sound. Meg braced herself against the stake, icily calm, holding her head high. Squire Picton's hand hesitated before the lighted taper reached the pile of rubble, twigs, and wood which comprised May Clayton's funeral pyre. "Do you repent, May Clayton?" he asked in a voice loud enough for the villagers to hear. "If ye repent now, mercy be shown you in the other world." May tossed her head, and her raven hair streamed in the wind. She looked over the crowd slowly and deliberately. "No, I do not repent," she replied. Then she turned toward the squire, her emerald eyes ablaze. "And you, Squire Picton, who brings me to my untimely end, mere fire will not stop me. The witches' Sabbath, 9 days hence, I shall ride on the wings of the wind. When you hear my laughter aboard the shriek of the gale, then you will have chose to shudder. Ye may burn my corporeal body, but my spirit will survive through the ages, and enter into animate and inanimate things alike to wreak vengeance upon you and yours. You think the mere burning of one witch will prevent evil. The devil will exert his influence upon the unsuspecting world in divers guises, clever inventions and so-called improvements of humanity. How subtle shall I use these to my advantage, finally exterminating all of you down to the last member of your clan. I curse you and your future generations. October shall bode ill for you and yours. I curse you in the name of the Prince of Darkness." Thus saying, he spat at the feet of the flustered and indignant squire. Without more ado, Squire Picton lit the fire. The blaze spread rapidly. A cloud of smoke enveloped the lovely girl, but was presently dispelled to enclose the slender witch writhing under the searing torture. The acrid smell of burning flesh assailed the nostrils of those present. The onlookers were silent, staring in morbid fascination, and the crackling of flames audible through the entire square, combined with the wailing wind and the intermittent whimpers of frightened children, into a kind of elemental funeral dirge for Meg Clayton. The witch said not a word and continued to writhe in silence. Horrible convulsions as her magnificent ebon tresses went up in a sheet of flame, and her soft white flesh turned black. It took a while to burn Meg Clayton, but at last nothing remained but a few charred pieces of flesh and ashes. The crowd dispersed. The bold, shameless behavior of the witch they would not term it bravery, and her angry death curse the subject of every tongue. 9 days later, on All Hallows Eve, Squire Picton died of a fatal kick from his fat bay mare, a singular occurrence, since his horse was known to be extremely gentle. The telephone downstairs in the parlor of Miss Simpkin's residence for refined gentlewomen tinkled apathetically. Miss Picton, telephone," a voice called shrilly, and presently the worthy lady, fortyish and angular, hesitant down the stairs to the summons. Yes, Miss Cranston, I would be pleased to remain with your little boy next Thursday evening," Miss Picton affirmed. "You will send your car around for me as usual, you say? About 7:30? Yes, that'll be fine. Thank you for calling." Miss Picton carefully replaced the receiver and missed daintily upstairs to her plain, austere little room. Idly she wondered whether she would have accepted the invitation to remain with the Cranstons' child while the parents were out for the evening. Miss Hortense Picton was what some people termed a professional sitter. That is, she stayed with children when their parents wished to go out for the evening. Of course, she could have done more profitable work of some sort, but she did not deem it altogether proper for ladies to be employed. "A woman's place is in the home," was her maxim, even though she was the last of her line and had never married and had a family of her own. But the meager insurance income left to her by her parents was not quite enough, even for Miss Picton's extremely plain mode of living. So to augment her income a trifle, she resorted to remain with children occasional evenings. Of course, she accepted appointments only by the best families. Aside from the remunerative possibilities, Miss Picton consoled herself with the thought that in her unique position she was afforded the chance of instilling peace and good into the hearts and minds of her little charges. She often read the children stories with a moral, if they were old enough to understand. She deplored the youthful trend toward comic strips and cartoon adventure magazines. Miss Picton was an ardent reformer, as all her predecessors had been, yet unfortunately, like many reformers, she was narrow-minded and intolerant. With her, reforming was an obsession. She continued to wonder whether she should have accepted the Cranstons' offer next Thursday night. She would not have if her budget had not been so sadly depleted. Next Thursday night was All Hallows Eve. In fact, it was the very reason that the Cranstons had desired her services, as they were attending a Halloween party that evening. It was 8 o'clock and Hortense Picton was safely ensconced in her chaste white bed. She always retired at 8 if she was not caring for children. Mechanically, she picked up the old family Bible. It was also her custom to read a chapter every evening before slumber overtook her. She leafed through the yellowed pages until she came to an ancient handwritten record, which she had read many times before. It was an account of the witch burning at Bloomsbury those many years ago. Certain sentences and words seemed to stand out as if they were printed in crimson lettering. So indelible were impressed upon her mind certain quoted fragments of Meg Clayton's curse. "My spirit will enter in intimate and inanimate things alike, evil influence upon the unsuspecting world, clever inventions and improvements." And then the sentence, "October shall bode ill for you and yours." And indeed, it had seemed that most members of the Picton family met with death or with unfortunate accidents during that month. Well, of course, there was Uncle Jonathan, mused Miss Hortense. He had been an exception, and had passed on in early January. She did not forget, though, that his death had been due to a fall down the stairs, which had occurred during the month of October, and had left him a helpless paralytic. She glanced through the records of the family Bible of some of the other unfortunate coincidences. There was her older sister, Agatha, who had inadvertently gotten into the path of an oncoming automobile one foggy October night. And then her vain, silly Aunt Matilda, who bought a special kind of mascara during that month and later went blind from the use of it. Her grandfather, who was killed by an explosion from a water heater, and her cousin, who had fallen asleep and had been accidentally asphyxiated from a faulty gas furnace. All these accidents had occurred during October. Were these deaths the direct result of the evil of which May Clayton had spoken loosed upon the world in the guise of clever inventions and so-called improvements of humanity? And Miss Picton recalled that her great-grandfather had been brutally slain by his best friend, who had unexpectedly gone berserk one Halloween night. The man had no motive for this deed, and had been sane enough before his crime, and seemed to be so afterwards, although he had of course been committed to an institution. And finally, Miss Picton's own father, a missionary, had been killed, and it was reported consumed by a supposedly converted cannibal chieftain on October 17th, while on a journey of peace and goodwill among the wilds of some far-off jungle. Her mother had passed on quietly from the shock several days later. True of all, the Pictons had not met violent deaths during the month of October. Several had contracted illnesses of one sort or another during that month, which later proved fatal, and one had gone mad during October and lived out the remainder of his life in a sanatorium. But taking into account, it was at once apparent that, curse or no curse, October seemed to be an extremely unfortunate month for the Picton family. It was only natural that Miss Fortson Picton should have a terror of this particular month. In vain she told herself that she was unchristian in being superstitious, but then there was always those records of deaths in the family Bible. She looked forward to the stroke of midnight on October 31st as eagerly as most people anticipate the midnight bells of December 31st. After 12 o'clock at midnight on Halloween, she felt as if the curse were lifted for another year, and that she could be assured of a continued peaceful existence at least until the following October. It was no wonder that she hesitated in accepting the Cranstons' proposal. Still, she thought, so far October had exercised no sinister influence upon her. She had escaped any disastrous results heretofore, and she was in seemingly good health, perhaps because she was the last of her family, and the line had no longer continued. Perhaps she was to be spared. She knew deep within herself that this would not be so, however, if the curse actually carried any power. May Clayton had sworn to eradicate the family down to its very last member. But surely nothing could happen to her between the hours of 7:30 and 12 midnight on the evening of October 31st. Not if she exercised proper precautions. The Cranstons would send their automobile for her, and after that she would be safe and secure in the Cranstons' manor. Thursday finally arrived, and with its cold, drizzling rain, which lasts throughout the day, at 6 o'clock Miss Picton had just settled down residence dining hall to a meal of vegetable salad, lentil soup, spinach, turnips, crumpets and jelly, and a cup of lukewarm weak tea. She was a strict vegetarian. When she was interrupted by a telephone call, the Cranstons had had motor trouble and would not be able to call for her. Could she, as a special favor, start out a little early in order to arrive by 8? As she knew from having been there so many times previously, the Cranston domicile was only about 10 blocks distance from her lodgings. Since there was no bus or other method of transportation, she would have to walk there, a distance of a mile or so, and of course the Cranstons would be only too happy to recompense her for such an inconvenience. Their car would be repaired, to be sure, in time for them to drive her home after they returned from the party.
She acquiesced grudgingly and returned to her meal. She shuddered nervously. This was an unlooked-for turn of events, and she did not relish the thought of that long walk on All Hallows Eve. But she could not change her plans now. The Cranstons were depending upon her. Her meal hastily consumed, she then hurried upstairs to tidy up. It never took Miss Pinkerton long to get ready. She wore no cosmetics. In her opinion, all cosmetics were the work of the devil and a sign of vanity. And her hair, brought back severely from the sharp-featured face, was tied into an old-fashioned knot at the nape of her neck. Hence her coif never needed frequent retouching. Seeing her on the street, the casual observer might remark that Miss Pinkerton's skirts were a bit too long to be modest. But Miss Pinkerton was concerned with respectable appearance only, and paid no attention to the capricious trends of fashion. Opaque lisle stockings and flat-heeled walking shoes of this sensible variety completed Miss Pinkerton's costume. On this evening, however, a black wool coat and a huge umbrella were added because of the inclement weather. It was with a vague sense of unease that she left the stuffy warmth of Miss Simpkin's residence for refined gentlewomen, and shielded herself with her large, old-fashioned umbrella from the light drizzle of rain, wended her way towards the Cranstons' abode. The sidewalks were damp and slippery, and the weather dismal. She passed by several teenaged youngsters just leaving a motion picture theater. Miss Pinkerton sniffed disdainfully. Moving pictures, more inventions of the devil for the temptations of young souls. She herself could proudly state that she had never been inside a motion picture house. The lurid advertisements displayed outside were quite enough to assure her that she would never care to investigate further. Jack-o'-lanterns leered at her from many of the shop windows as she passed by. Noisy children out, despite the unpleasant weather. Many with raincoats over makeshift Halloween costumes ran up and down the streets. One brat, more bold than the rest, and feeling secure beneath the realistic camouflage of a werewolf mask, crept up behind Miss Pinkerton and startled her with a loud boo. He laughed tauntingly as she jumped, frightened by this unexpected outburst. "Little heathen!" she shouted indignantly, and brought her umbrella sharply down upon the hapless urchin. Miss Pinkerton prided herself upon knowing how to deal with unruly children, and believed firmly in the use of the rod, although she never did so with any of the children she took care of, lest their parents should object. Many a time the child needed a whipping, thought she. There was no comprehending the new-fangled ideas of these modern parents. Bristling with indignation, she crossed the street, her large black umbrella held at an angle, protecting her from the onslaught of the rain, obscured her view somewhat. Suddenly there was a ear-splitting screech of brakes, and Miss Pinkerton found herself sprawled in the center of the street on the slippery pavement with a curious crowd gathering about her. "Geez, lady, what you looking? Where you're going?" came a harsh voice from the driver of the car. "Are you all right?" Dazedly, Miss Pinkerton got to her feet. Yes, I'm all right," she assured the crowd somewhat testily. "No, I do not need help, thank you." She glanced at her watch, fortunately intact despite her fall. 7:45, and she was supposed to be at the Cranstons at 8. She hurried on. The crowd, perceiving that no one was hurt, dispersed. What a narrow escape that was, Miss Pinkerton thought. She remembered her sister's fate and shuddered. Inspecting her umbrella ruefully, she saw that it had become somewhat damaged, and in the excitement she had neglected to obtain the driver's name and license number. Oh well, too late now. With the quickened steps she hastened on. Breathless, she arrived at the Cranstons' residence at 8:01. She pressed the bell, and a succession of musical chimes sounded within. Slowly the door swung inward. An apparition of the devil confronted Miss Pinkerton, who involuntarily screamed of terror. Come now, I don't look as realistic as all that," boomed a jovial, reassuring voice. Miss Pinkerton inspected the figure more closely and perceived it to be none other than Mr. Cranston, attired in Halloween costume. "Oh, I'm sorry," she stammered confusedly, "but you look like the I mean, I didn't recognize you at first." I'm sorry I frightened you. I had to answer the door personally. Thursday evening is both the maid's and the butler's night off. Come in. Her mind harkened back to her grandfather's death, the hands of a friend, and she found herself entertaining doubts concerning Mr. Cranston. He flashed her a devilish smile. Come in, he repeated. You must be cold after walking in all this rain. I do believe there's a storm brewing. Come on, and warm yourself by the fireplace. He led the way to the drawing room, where Miss Cranston, resplendent and elaborate Egyptian princess costume, was reading bedtime stories to her 6-year-old son, who, attired in woolly pink sleeping pajamas, snuggled cozily in her lap. Hello there, drawled Miss Cranston. So nice to have you back again to stay with Teddy. So my husband's costume startled you, did it? I thought it extremely realistic myself. She laughed gaily. I guess I'm rather upset anyway, replied Miss Picton, and proceeded to relate her harrowing experience with the automobile. And just look at my umbrella, it's ruined beyond repair. The little boy inspected the drooping, tattered article with wide, interested eyes. Dear, dear, how annoying, exclaimed Miss Cranston. I don't blame you for being upset. Won't you have a little drink to settle your nerves? She proffered some amber liquid in a cut glass bottle. Miss Peyton flushed indignantly. No, thank you, she replied in a polite but frigid tone. Miss Cranston, more amused than piqued, smiled indignantly and placed the bottle within the liquor cabinet. Even if Miss Picton were a bit prudish, she was an honest and dependable person to look after Teddy. I do hope that you won't be nervous staying alone in the house, she continued. You know where the telephone is. If you want anything, we'll be at the Brightonhams. That's Cardinal 8159, by the way. They should be here soon, shouldn't they, dear? She addressed this last remark to her husband, who nodded and glanced at his watch. The Brightonhams have very kindly offered to call for us since our car is being repaired at the garage. Miss Cranston explained to Miss Picton. Our car would be repaired in time for us to drive you home after the party, however. Oh, there's the doorbell now. I'll bet that's them. She arose hastily, and Teddy slid from her lap. Goodbye, dearie. She heartily kissed her little son. Do lock up for us, will you, Miss Picton? She added. You're familiar with all the exits and entrances by now. Goodbye. We'll be home in about 12 or 12:30. The slam of the front door echoed throughout the empty house. How utterly pagan, said Miss Picton, as they departed. Civilian people celebrating Halloween with costumes and false faces. I don't suppose they are either realizing perpetuating the evil tradition of the devil's advocates. It is wicked, that's what it is. She proceeded to lock the various windows and doors. There were 9 doors that she could remember, plus 2 French windows and a dining hall. She also closed all the other windows. Although the steady downpour of rain had ceased, a strong wind was blowing, presaging a violent storm. Teddy followed her about. She settled herself comfortably before the blazing fire in the living room. Teddy said, Read me a story, please. Miss Peyton looked disapprovingly at the garnished, paper-bound cartoon book he handed her. Humph! Owl Man on Mars. What could the Cranstons be thinking of filling their child's mind? Such imaginative nonsense, especially just before bedtime. I have something much nicer here to read for you, cooed Miss Picton, drawing forth from her capacious handbag a book entitled 10 Moral Tales for Good Little Children. I don't want to hear these stories, Teddy emphatically objected. Then he directed his attention to the ruined umbrella propped in the corner. Oh, your bummer shot got wrecked, didn't it? Surveyed it with amusement, and then opened the umbrella. Oh, don't open it in here, protested Miss Picton. Why not? Queried the little boy, his eyebrows raised in a comical expression of surprise. I won't hurt it. It's busted anyway. Miss Picton didn't want to admit that she was superstitious about open umbrellas in the house bringing bad luck. As a matter of fact, she wasn't usually, but on Halloween and in a strange, lonely house. Well, she didn't want to take any chances. Oh, come sit on my lap. I'll read you a nice story, she said, changing the subject. Teddy obediently followed and put away the umbrella and clambered on Miss Picton's bony knees.
He balanced there as best as he could, while she read in a dry, correct voice one of the 10 moral tales. Teddy drowsed. The telephone rang, interrupting her recitation. She lifted the receiver and said hello. A burst of demoniacal laughter greeted her ears. Horrified, she replaced the receiver. "What's the matter, Miss Picton?" queried Teddy. "Oh, nothing. It was just some children playing Halloween tricks," she replied, forcing a note of calmness into her voice. Was it a Halloween prank, or was it something else? Maybe it was a burglar phoning to assess whether she and Teddy were alone in the house before he broke in, or kidnappers. She had read of such stories in newspapers. The devilish laughter still rang in her ears. "I must get a grip on myself," she resolved. "I'm just being silly." She glanced at her watch. 8:45. Only 3 hours and 15 minutes more until the stroke of midnight. Then she would feel released from this insidious reign of terror for another year. Well, she read to Teddy until 9, and then took him to bed. The minutes ticked leadenly as she droned on in a monotonous voice. Teddy relapsed once more into a drowse. Another glance at her watch. It was 9 o'clock. "Come now, Teddy, we'll go to bed," cooed Miss Picton, in what was meant to be a sugary, coaxing tone. Teddy raised no objection, although he instinctively shrank from Miss Picton's cold, moist hands as he picked him up and carried him pressed across her hard, flat bosom upstairs to his room. Miss Picton put Teddy down as she entered his attractively furnished nursery. An array of toys was strewn over the floor. Suddenly her feet went out from underneath her, and she fell, hitting her head against a gaily painted bureau. She had trotted upon a toy fire truck. "Oh, Miss Picton," Teddy wailed, "you aren't hurt, are you?" She was angered by the child's carelessness, in which his playthings scattered about, but managed a weak, forced smile as she said rather sharply, "No, Teddy, I'm all right, but perhaps you'll realize the importance of putting away your toys." Another near accident. Coincidence? She shrugged the bruised place of her head. Teddy's childish solicitude pleased her, and although she had no genuine love for children, as she tucked Teddy into bed, she could not help noticing how angelic he looked in his clean pink pajamas, with his tousled golden curls tumbling over the white pillow. He was, in her opinion, despite his pampered existence amidst the atmosphere of cocktails, cigarettes, and the modern way of life, despite his enjoyment of those degrading comic books, one of the best behaved children that she had ever taken care of. Miss Picton supervised his bedtime prayers and turned out the light and returned downstairs. It was lonelier now, without Teddy to keep her company. The large, ornate clock in the hall boomed 9:30, an outrageous hour for a 6-year-old to be getting to bed, she mused. When she was a little girl, she always retired promptly at 7, even up to the time that she was 12 or 13 years of age. She settled down comfortably in the armchair and extracted from her enormous handbag a volume of little gems of Victorian verse, and began to read therefrom. She had read for about half an hour when she had a fleeting impression that she had heard something in the kitchen. Her scalp crawled beneath her tight-bound hair. She thought of phoning for help, but knew that she would appear ridiculous if it turned out to be merely her imagination. The noise may have been only the wind. Armed with a poker from the fireplace, she timidly tiptoed to the kitchen. She switched on the light and stood tensely waiting. No sound. Then suddenly, behind her came a soft thud, thud. Whirled around her face a mask of fright. Nothing there. Again, thud, thud. She almost sobbed with relief. It was the door leading from the kitchen to the basement. A draught of cold air made the door rattle, even though it was closed. Then she remembered that she had forgotten to bolt the cellar door. The wind had probably blown it open, and this was the reason for the draught. Hurriedly she switched on the cellar light and ran down the shadowy stairs. There stood the door wide open, and wind blowing in great gusts. The storm was already getting under way now. She slammed the door and bolted it. To think that she had been so careless. Why, anyone might have sneaked in. She thought of that anonymous phone call,
and cold chills raced down her back as she rushed frantically upstairs and bolted the kitchen door leading to the basement. Her heart aflutter, she returned to the drawing room. Once again she resumed her reading, but somehow she could not keep her mind on the book. She kept glancing nervously around and behind her. Impatiently she looked at her watch. 10:30. 1.5 hours more. Again her reading was interrupted, this time by a heavy knocking on the front entrance. She put her book down and stood rooted in the spot. The peremptory rapping was repeated. She walked cautiously towards the door and called out, "Who's there?" but could hear no answer above the wail of the wind outside. Afraid to unbolt the entranceway, she opened the small aperture set in the panel and peered outside. She could see no one. Did she fancy that she heard a taunting laugh above the sound of the wind? Bewildered and frightened, she turned to her place by the fireside. The dying embers glared up at her like red, hungry eyes of demons. The storm outside increased in fury. Suddenly all the lights went out, leaving Horton Picton enveloped in a gloomy darkness. Horrified, she crouched in her chair. The embers in the fireplace gave forth a faint glow, making weird shadows in the room which were more terrifying than the total absence of light. Miss Picton was by now objectively terrified. She no longer had any doubt, but she was inexorable being drawn into the power of the witch's curse. She reviewed the ominous events of the evening, first the near accident with the automobile, then the mysterious telephone call, her falling in Teddy's nursery, the cellar being left open. Someone might have sneaked into the house at that, and might even now be laying in wait for her in the shadows. She shuddered at the thought. Then the strange knocking at the door, and now the lights being turned out. She wished that she knew what time it was, but could not see the dial of her watch by the feeble light of the embers. The darkness was fraught with unseen terrors. Was it her imagination, or was there someone, something lurking in the shadows? Supposedly that Teddy should awaken, become frightened and cry out. Could she summon enough courage to mount the stairs, or would unseen fingers clutch at her before she reached Teddy's room? She longed for Teddy to be by her side now. Anyone, anything warm and comforting and alive. The house assumed the aspect of a chamber of horrors. Why, it was filled with hundreds of clever inventions and so-called improvements for humanity, which the sorceress had mentioned in her curse so many years ago. If May Clayton's spirit were to manifest itself now, which of these instruments of the devil would she choose to animate? The water heater in the cellar, so supposing that should explode, killing her as it had her grandfather, the heavy chandelier just above her head, supposing it would fall. She could get an electric shock while turning on the lights. Every article of furniture in the room seemed charged with malignant force. She half expected the curtains to reach out and strangle her, or the sofa pillows to suffocate her. Cold perspiration beaded on her forehead. "Oh, dear God," she whispered fervently, desperately. "I don't want to die. Save me from the witch's curse." Suddenly she thought of the telephone on the coffee stand beside the chair. Of course, the telephone. Strange how one's reason becomes paralyzed at a time like this. She lifted the receiver and dialed operator, hoping that she had dialed correctly in the dark. She listened. Something was wrong. There was no sound on the wires. Eventually she realized that the phone was dead. Hopelessly she banged down the receiver, put her head in her arms, and sobbed aloud. Dimly she heard the sinister tones of the hall clock strike 11:30. Oh, only half an hour more. How ironic that the curse should have caught up with me now. She sobbed unrestrained. In the midst of her hysteria, the telephone rang eagerly. She snatched it up. Oh, how comforting a voice, the sound of a human voice, even if it were from miles away. But how could the telephone have rung? It was dead only a few minutes ago. Her voice came faltering. Hello? Hello, this is the lineman. I hope the electricity being turned off didn't frighten you. The storm blew down some of the lines and left you without lights or phone service for a while. Everything's okay now. The lines are repaired and the power's been restored. I drove up and knocked at your door to warn you about the temporary blackout so you wouldn't be scared, but I guess you didn't hear me. Is everything okay?
At your place now.
Fortson Picton, almost wet with relief. Oh yes, she affirmed tremulously. Thank you so much. She hurriedly wept away the remnants of her tears, blew her nose loudly on a dainty laced handkerchief, and smoothed back her hair. It was now 11:45 by her watch. Soon the Cranstons would be back. She must compose herself then and get rid of all traces of her outburst. She mustn't let them know how foolish she had been. She went to the kitchen and ran some cold water on her face. Then she returned to the drawing room, turned on every lamp and electric light, bathing the place in cheerful, pleasant brilliance. Miss Picton sat back comfortably in her easy chair and picked up her little gems of Victorian verse. Although still somewhat shaken, she could almost laugh at her fears now. Miss Picton, Teddy's plaintive voice came from upstairs. What could that little rascal want at this hour? She murmured to herself in annoyance. Her watch indicated that she was just 5 minutes until midnight. She hurried up the stairs. Oh, Miss Picton, repeated Teddy, and that lady fancied that she detected tears in his little voice. For a moment the thought returned to her that someone might have sneaked into the house at the time she had left the cellar door open, might even be in Teddy's bedroom now, and that the terrible child might be calling for help. She hesitated at the door for an instant, but dismissed her thoughts, further emboldened by the fact that she was now 5 minutes until the termination of October 31st. The room was in total darkness. Her foot came in contact with something soft and woolly lying across the floor. She remembered the plaintive urgency in Teddy's voice. Her heart seemed to cease beating as she stood there, too terrified to scream. Finally, her trembling fingers located the switch at the night table. Here was Teddy sitting bolt upright in his bed, his eyes wide with horror. Unpaused, Fortson Picton directed her gaze to what lay at her feet, a large-sized cuddly teddy bear. She breathed a long sigh of relief and hurried to Teddy's bedside. What is it? Why did you call out? She asked. Oh, Miss Picton, I had an awful dream about an old witch standing over my bed. But that was just a dream, Miss Picton said. Everything's all right now. Go back to sleep. Kiss me good night first, Teddy begged. Miss Picton had a violent distaste of physical contact of any sort, even when it came to kissing children good night. But seeing the imploring look in Teddy's large blue eyes, she complied. It was odd how she never noticed before tonight how a sweet, adorable child Teddy was. As she leaned towards him, the big clock downstairs began to toll the hour of midnight. Teddy's golden curls touched her stringy gray hair. His chubby arms went around her neck. Some latent maternal instinct within her caused her to draw him close. Suddenly, the chubby arms became wiry and muscular. The dimpled, childish hands became elongated and developed sharp talons. Startled, Miss Picton opened her eyes and saw, not Teddy's innocent blue eyes, but red demon orbs boring into her own. Sharp fangs bit into her scrawny neck. She screamed once, shrilly, and as the hall clock last somber tone, denoting midnight, faded away, Miss Picton sank into oblivion. Happy Halloween.